Welcome to Cyber Leaders with me, Ciaran Martin.
And me, James Lyne. Now, we're both from SANS who are kindly backing this podcast. I myself am a techie, a massive geek that has spent my life chasing cybercriminals around the internet.
I'm not a techie, more of that later. I dealt with cybersecurity policy and operations in government in the UK and set up its National Cybersecurity Centre. But together, James and I are trying to unpack the weird and wacky world of tech security and all the complicated things that it involves.
That's right, Ciaran. This podcast is a voice for security leaders. We want CISOs, security directors, and everyone beyond to build up their knowledge of what works, what doesn't, and secure their organizations more comprehensively and quickly. And ideally, make life a little bit harder for the cyber criminals on the way.
Yes, of course, we need to do that. And you always say that. And I know you mean it, and so do I. But look, I need a bit of a politics fix today, James. The world's on fire, and I'm afraid we've just been doing a little bit too much techie cyber.
I actually don't think it's possible for that statement to be true, Ciaran. I mean, it's...
Oh.
But anyway, I'll entertain your premise for a moment. It is still a cyber podcast. Maybe if you need a politics fix, you should go off and try and get onto The Rest is Politics or Joe Rogan or whatever it is you want to listen to.
Well, I'm not sure Joe Rogan would have me. But anyway, all I mean is, of course, it's a cyber podcast, but since we last spoke, and actually we could say that pretty much every week, the world's gone a bit mad, and I think we need to talk about that.
Okay, that's probably fair. Look, here's a deal for you, Ciaran. I'll let you witter on about geopolitics and instability and all that, providing you relate it back to how organizations cope with the whole mess in terms of cybersecurity. If you can make it actionable, we'll have our little politics fanfare. Deal?
Provisional deal. That's a lot to ask, so I might need some help.
All right, well, I'll try and help you with that then. I've got an idea.
Oh?
Yeah, I think if we bring on a certain remarkable guest who straddles both these domains we're talking about, we might get somewhere. Now, this guest in particular has an outstanding career as an academic, specializing in cyber and disinformation, particularly coming out of Russia. She's a PhD and 3 master's degrees and has published an acclaimed and best-selling academic book on Russian disinformation campaigns, as well as a cyber thriller novel. No doubt some inspirations in both directions there, I'm sure. She's been involved in very high-level cyber diplomacy, and now she's joined the cyber defense profession as an associate director at Accenture, that was hard to say, specializing in advising companies about how to manage the way in which geopolitical risk affects technology, including cyber threats. So what do you think? How's that for concession, Ciaran? Will that help?
Well, that does sound promising, and I think I know who this might be, but James, you better confirm it.
It is, of course, the incredible Dr. Bilyana Lilly. Welcome, Bilyana.
Hi, James and Ciaran. I'm really glad to be here. Thank you for having me.
Oh, we're very, very excited. So thank you, Bilyana, for coming on. Thank you, James, for that stupendous introduction of the stupendous guest. So this will very much do as a way of squaring the circle between the mad world of today and how it affects organizations' ability to do cyber defense. So well done, James. I don't often say this, but you've done well here. So you can put that on your latest t-shirt, Bilyana, in joke. Sorry.
The collection is ever expanding, but let's get to the point then. So Bilyana, particularly with you, we're going to have to be disciplined so we don't go on all day. There's a lot we could talk about, including the obvious plot for your next cyber thriller. There's a lot to cover. So I suggest we first talk about your whole career researching Russian tech ops, and then we go on to use that as a platform for talking about some of the ways in which these and other types of political plays threaten the sorts of organizations whose people listen to this podcast and what they can do about them. That'll make sure we live up to our promise to make it actionable, won't it, Ciaran?
Absolutely. And then I'll need to ask you about Accenture's official position on Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the tech sanctions on China, tariffs, the proposals for the US to annex Canada, Greenland, and the Panama Canal. How about that?
I think we might have to put a few limits in here, Ciaran.
Oh, all right. Look, it was worth a try. Now, I'm going to start with something. Actually, it's a question for you, James. A bit left field. Have you heard of Tom Hanks?
What sort of moron do you think I better not answer that, actually?
Well, I'll take that as a yes. Now, have you heard of Edward Snowden?
Oh, yes. Where are you going with this?
Well, finally, question 3 of 3. Have you heard of Andrew Krusky?
Well, that is a very hard no, and I'm not going to attempt the pronunciation either.
Okay. Well, look, these 3 questions, what connects Tom Hanks, Edward Snowden, and Andrew Krusky, more of him in a bit, they're all people that Bilyana has encountered in her glittering cyber career. But now for the big one, as far as I'm concerned. Andrew Krusky, one of the most interesting and important, obscure, but frankly, on occasion scary people involved in 21st century cyber politics. I only met him once briefly in Singapore. Lovely chap. Now, you met him much, much earlier. First of all, his lack of fame is completely inverse to his importance, so you'd better explain who he is. So tell us first, who is Andrew Krusky and how did you encounter him?
Ciaran, I'll completely agree with your assessment of his character. He's a very interesting guy. I actually met him at a conference and I had the opportunity to first observe him interacting with other officials and then speak to him one-on-one. He had just assumed the position of one of the most senior officials in the Russian government responsible for information security. So he was Russia's cyber guy. And he didn't have a cybersecurity background. He had a diplomacy background. And our interaction was very interesting. We spoke about Edward Snowden, by the way, and he immediately told me that he was a whistleblower. Krusky was very proud of the fact that he just landed in Russia and now he's basically a friend of Russia. The very first discussion basically I had about Edward Snowden was with a Russian official in Russia. So I thought this is pretty iconic and ironic. And then I had a discussion with Krusky about the DDoS attacks against Estonia in 2007. Some of our audience may not remember this, but those were 4 waves of DDoS attacks that were launched against government, financial, and media infrastructure in Estonia. And they marked one of the very first instances of massive, large-scale cyber attacks used against the country. We had in the West a different interpretation of the origin of these attacks, but Andrei Krusky tried very adamantly to convince me that the attacks were coming from the United States and Israel. And he claimed that technical attribution clearly identified the United States and Israel as the perpetrators. So we had a discussion about that. And I remember that because I took it later as one of the points to prove or disprove in my book.
Well, we're just about to come on to your book, but what an extraordinary story. And this remarkable figure, all I remember is, firstly, him arguing with me with exactly the same conviction, both on and off stage in Singapore. Secondly, the sheer longevity. I mean, this must be 10 years after your encounter with him and he was still going. And then thirdly, and I've never known why this is the case, but after becoming one of the preeminent fixtures, certainly from non-democratic states on the international cyber diplomacy circuit for 25 years, he's finally retired and he must be one of the few senior Russian officials in the last 3 years who has actually properly retired rather than accidentally, in quotations, fallen out of a window. There you go. James, where we go next?
Quite an impressive career accomplishment to finish off on there. But, well, look, let's pivot a little bit from these individuals to the domain in which they operated and what you've learned over the years. So you went on to specialize in researching Russian information operations, or information warfare, if you prefer. Certainly sounds a lot cooler, doesn't it? And you did a PhD in which you then turned into a book, a very successful book. So in line with the overall superficiality of this podcast, that could go on a t-shirt too, Ciaran, could you summarize your life's work for us in, I don't know, say 30, 45 seconds, something like that? Do your best. What have you learned so far?
Wow. Okay. So
no pressure.
No pressure at all, Bilyana. I'm cybersecurity and Russian information warfare expert. Now I'm also covering China. I'm also learning and specializing in trying to understand how the Chinese government is using cyber operations, disinformation, influence operations, and economic coercion as a tool of warfare and how that impacts businesses. So I'd say my focus is digital threats to businesses, and this is where I build my expertise.
Interesting you kind of mentioned the spanning into China now. So having, studied kind of Russian information operations for a long time, and now looking at China, what kind of big differences do you notice? Are there variations in tactics or approach or culture that are significant? Can you give us a glimpse into the mind of, Russian information warfare for those listening and maybe haven't studied it as much?
Sure. I have been focused on Russian information warfare for about 10 years, and I have built my knowledge from the domain that I previously focused on, which is missile defense and disarmament issues, because the type of military thinking that Russia applies to foreign policy and specifically to warfare in the traditional warfare domains is similar to the military thinking that they're applying to the information space. The way I see it is that for them, it's another domain of warfare. It's an extension of their military culture from the other domains. And they have a doctrine on information warfare, which clearly identifies the objectives of the so-called information warfare or information confrontation that the Russian government conducts against adversaries. And in Russian, we call it different things in the West. We call it hybrid warfare, information warfare, measures short of war, gray zone tactics. There are a number of different terms, political warfare. And there are certain subtle nuances and differences between them, but I typically use the term information warfare because this is what the Russian government uses in its doctrine. I would say that it's a very diverse playbook, and I focused my PhD and my book on trying to understand the patterns in Russia's application of all of these different measures short of war against NATO member states. And I focus not only on identifying the patterns, but also the correlation between these different activities and trying to identify, can we predict some of these cyber attacks based on either international events or other factors? And can we even sequence them? And I, for example, found out that in the event of specifically disinformation, in a lot of cases, there is a very clear pattern between spikes or increased disinformation campaigns just before DDoS attacks, or there's an organization of protests that's coordinated with a DDoS attack with disinformation campaigns. So there are a lot of these coordinated activities. And in the case of China, I'm observing similar patterns. Chinese behavior, and it's almost enviably strategic for a Westerner, because we tend to elect a new government every 4 to 5 years and policies change. We're dealing with disruptions, with turmoil, with uncertainty. Well, in the case of the Russian government and the Chinese government, they're clearly established policies and the governments are consistent, and there's continuity and consistency for decades. And in the case of China, we see that similar playbooks being adopted with slightly varying objectives. The Chinese government has this Made in China 2025 policy, where it's clearly stated that it wants to achieve competitiveness and be a champion in specific industrial sectors, which opens the gates for IP theft, for espionage, for unfair practices, competition, and that impacts Western companies as well as Western governments.
I just want to jump in there, because this is fascinating and the difference and similarities between Russia and China, but I've been itching to ask you a question as you've been explaining this. And it's based a bit on my own previous operational experience and just some of the stuff over the past few years. So when it comes to Russia, might come to China in a bit, when it comes to Russia, clearly they've got intent, they've got doctrine, they've got capabilities. Are they actually any good at this stuff? Because sometimes when you look at their cyber performance since they murderously invaded Ukraine, hasn't shifted the dial. I used to deal with some of their information operations and some of them are pretty good. Some of them were terrible. From their point of view, what are they getting out of this? Is it any good?
Well, Ciaran, first of all, your threshold is very high because you're a scholar and an expert. So I don't suspect you will be one of those that will find, for example, the flat earth, let's say, theory plausible, right?
Well,
Maybe.
it had a good run. But,
it is, right? But you're not a flat earther, I imagine. No?
No. I got over that a few years ago.
I'm still working on my addiction.
Good for you. But you see how this still has a following. So it may seem implausible to you, and some of those tricks that they're using, the disinformation narratives that they're spreading, they seem obviously incorrect and fake to you. But to a certain part of the population, they really hit home and they take over our imaginations. They lead to changing our opinions. We gather in our echo chambers and start discussing those narratives and believing them. So I think in my research, I try to assess the effectiveness of Russia's disinformation campaigns and cyber operations, not through my own lens or through Western lens, because a lot of us that have focused on this for years, we see the patterns, we see the cracks on the wall. But I try to look at them from the position of the effectiveness of what the Russian government is trying to achieve. And then looking domestically in different countries, which the Russian government has launched these campaigns, what is the effectiveness there vis-a-vis what the Russian government is trying to achieve? And I would say that they have been effective at times and ineffective in other times.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, when it comes to supporting far-right parties, for example, in Germany or in the United States or in other places, they have had a certain level of effectiveness that is scary at this point.
And are they ahead of China in this? Because by my reading, you may disagree, and you probably study it more closely than I do, but China slower at this game initially, and some of their recent forays. I mean, I saw one set of bots they had on X, which if you replied to them, they replied in Mandarin or said as an AI-generated bot, I can't respond. Now, obviously, that's just a silly example of one rubbish operation, but would you put Russia ahead of China in this space, or what do you make of China?
Maybe that was all a ploy. It was actually deployed by the French pretending to be the Chinese. Or Occam's razor might apply. Just saying.
I'm now regretting doing a geopolitics episode because James is trying to start a war. Another one. So on the question, China, are they catching up to Russia in this? Are they any good? Should we worry about them?
I think we should, but I think the way to look at it is for their priorities. I think that they have other tools and other channels through which to exert pressure and influence and achieve their objectives, and they vary from Russia's. So we're not comparing apples to apples. We're comparing apples to oranges. So for the Chinese government, their priorities are Taiwan, relations with the United States,
Right.
increasing their global influence, economic influence, creating champions among their domestic companies, which they are very actively supporting, as we know. So because of that, I don't think it's fair to compare their tools one-on-one in this way.
Supply chain attacks surged to 245% from 2023 to 2024. And breaches like the Oracle Cloud breach, GitHub Action supply chain compromise, and vulnerabilities such as Log4j have proven just how one compromised supplier can disrupt thousands of organizations. Whether you're looking for comprehensive training, expert-led webcast, or ready-to-use templates and frameworks, the new SANS Supply Chain Security Hub has everything you need to secure your supply chain, from development to deployment. Explore our resources at sans.org/supplychain.
That's really interesting. And just one more thing before I let James back in. I'm sorry to hog the floor, but in terms of trying to bring all this to life for corporate defenders, when it's a cyber attack, we can say, look, it could be your turn, could be targeted, could be untargeted, whatever it is, but you can bring it to life. In terms of this corrosive sewer of disinformation and misinformation and lies and information ops and so forth, does that matter to... I mean, it matters to Western societies, but how do you make it matter to individual units within Western societies? I mean, governments might care about it. Who else will care about it? Do people, CISOs running corporate networks or their bosses at C-suite level? I mean, should people in the private domain in Western societies care about this type of thing? And is there anything usefully they can do about it?
Absolutely, they should. And I think that geopolitics and geopolitical uncertainties since 2022, especially since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, have become an imperative for global companies. They no longer can ignore them. And we can see that also reflected in reports of world forums that focus on different trends that impact and risks that impact businesses. For example, the World Economic Forum's report from this year identified armed conflict as a number one risk to businesses. And if you look at the top 4, 3 of them are related to geopolitics. I think the second was either climate change or natural disasters. And then we had...
Misinformation was pretty high, wasn't it?
Exactly, James. Disinformation and misinformation, I think, was number 4. And then geoeconomic confrontation, I think, was number 3. So this is how geopolitics enters business. And we see today, if you look back at the number of companies that had to hastily exit Russia because of the sanctions imposed on Russia due to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, they lost over $107 billion. And companies with significant presence in China are paying attention. There was a survey conducted last year, October, November of 2024, that showed that 30% of US companies that have presence in China are either considering exiting or have already planned to exit China. So this is a significant shift from earlier because now businesses are realizing that there are very material disruptive effects from geopolitical tensions that can impact survivability, the viability of a business, and they pay attention.
Well, fair enough. That's definitely me told. Over to you, James.
Right, look, I've got one area I'd like to probe on, and then we'll pivot because we've got to get to the novel. Of course we do. Bilyana, I think it's really interesting. There's a lot of stereotypes out there about Russian information operations and cyber tactics. And of course, you've spent real time studying these folks. And I loved your description of the evolution of how they think about this from kind of traditions of warfare through to today. If you kind of think about, your observation of how they behave and how people in the kind of broader corporate world or those planning to do these attacks might think of the Russians, is there any kind of single big thing you'd highlight as a gap between expectation and reality? A kind of, hey, people think this about them, but actually they do this. Or do you think people are fairly attuned at this point to how the Russians play this grand cyber game?
That's a great question, James. So the broader population, I don't think really thinks about Russian cyber operations the way we do. If you talk about our community, I think we have a fairly good understanding of the limitations of Russia's cyber forces and cyber capabilities. I've written several articles on this with a good friend and colleague of mine, Jocharovich, and we've covered that a few times. I would say that they're not limitless. And I have looked at, for example, how Russia's cyber forces and cyber capabilities have been degraded since Russia's invasion of Ukraine because of a number of factors, including having to deploy a lot of forces to the front, having sanctions that limit Russia's ability to purchase Western software, update its existing hardware, software systems, and conduct maintenance on them. I've also looked at a really interesting number. Your listeners may remember that Vladimir Putin announced partial mobilization in Russia in September of 2022 in order to recruit Russians to go to the front and fight in Ukraine. And that resulted in the immediate flight of a lot of Russians who just tried to flee Russia because they didn't want to fight. And there were a number of protests that erupted in major Russian cities. There were lines and lines of cars with individuals trying to exit Russia at different border points with Finland and Georgia and other places. Even flights all of a sudden spiked in prices, flights to Turkey, to Cyprus, because people just wanted to flee the country. That resulted, according to some statistics, first of all, of course, we don't really trust the Russian government's reporting because a lot of those statistics are probably screwed. Not screwed. I apologize. Please correct this.
Nope,
Skewed.
that's staying in. That's staying in.
But also screwed.
Keeping that.
Oh,
That's in the
okay.
outtakes.
They're both true.
Yeah, skewed and screwed. I mean, both are true. Both are true.
But anyway, don't trust the statistics. But according to some, there was at least 10% of those individuals that fled the country that were IT experts and IT specialists. And this means that Russia's ability to recruit for its cyber forces is also diminishing because its labor force has diminished. So technically, and from a human perspective, their capabilities have been degraded over the past few years. James, how's that for an answer?
I think that's really fascinating. Of course, the one thing we all have to do is pay attention to how tactics change over time. There are lots of things that don't change quickly, but when they do change, they change really fast. And that can certainly be true of these kind of major cyber operators like we're discussing. But let's change direction a little bit here. Something we have to ask you about, the novel. Now, I haven't read the novel yet, so I guess that's my homework after this podcast. But is it one of those ones, like they do in cyber, where everyone dies because some spotty teenager in a hoodie spent an hour writing some code in his mum's basement, usually in Visual Basic using Excel or compiling it with a JPEG or something bizarre? Or have you cracked the secret of how to make tech conflict realistic but still interesting? So tell us about Digital Mindhunter's Spotty Teenagers. By the way, brilliant title.
Thank you so much, James. Wow, that's like a good plot for a second novel, maybe. We'll have to modify a little bit.
It's been done. It's been done.
It's none of that. None of that. So I first wrote the novel because I've been an academic or a researcher for about 20 years, and I've always been confined by what the sources tell me, by the facts. I couldn't deviate from the story. And in addition to that, there were so many fascinating stories in our field that I couldn't write about in my academic publications because my colleagues have asked me not to, and they've just shared them with me in confidence, or because I just didn't have enough data to back up a particular generalized conclusion that I was trying to draw from them. So because our field is so fascinating, it's full of diverse and interesting characters. And I know this because I was in missile defense before. My expertise was missile defense, disarmament, and it was a very stale field, very slow-moving field. And when I entered our field, it's so action-packed and so creative and so exciting. And I wanted to have an opportunity and experiment with bringing those stories to life. And I did that because I typically go to a lot of conferences every year, and I love interacting with our community, but we tend to meet the same people over and over again. And we talk to each other about cyber threats and information warfare and disinformation, and it's good and it's important, but we don't really talk to the communities outside of our own. And I wanted to use the book as an opportunity to bridge that gap and to spread the message about the importance of cyber operations and disinformation to the general public. And to show that, because in the military doctrines of both China and Russia and Iran and other adversaries, the target of their information warfare operations is not just the politicians or the military, it is every single member of our society. And that's why I wrote the book. And the book, I am hoping, is a little more original than your plot, James. No offense. I based it a lot on personal experiences, but it's all fictionalized. And it's about a female researcher who finds herself basically in the middle of information warfare. She breaks into a Russian military conference and she collects information. She realizes that the Russian government is going to deploy AI to try to manipulate US elections. And then on her way back, she encounters an insider threat in an organization where she works. And that insider threat is working for the Chinese government. And from there, the story shows how those two interact. There are a lot of other interesting bits and pieces in there. The idea is that I wanted to raise awareness about how every single one of us is an unwitting participant or a target in those operations, and that it is important that we understand that.
Brilliant. And what happens at the end? Sorry, only kidding.
Oh, no, I'm not telling you that, Ciaran. You have to read it.
But actually, it speaks to one of our previous exchanges, Bilyana, about bringing this to life for organizations and people that may not have thought about it or realized it in a way that they might with a routine cybercrime attack, but maybe not in terms of disinformation. So fascinating. Can't wait to read it.
Thank you.
But just to help us move on, we did say we'd get to this crucial discussion about how organizations and everybody else manages these geopolitical tech risks. And you're a renowned expert on Russia. You know about the others. We've talked a lot about this. So almost transitioning from your academic career into your new career advising companies, I just want to get a sense of where we are at this point in history. Is it as mad as it seems right now? Is it as unstable and worrying as it seems? Or are we forgetting that actually throughout most of the course of human history, things have been pretty bad? Stability is actually pretty unusual. I suppose when you're talking to your clients or your friends, the communities you just talked about, how unnerved should we be right now?
I'm personally very concerned. I've been studying this space for about 20 years. And before that, I worked for the Red Cross in Bulgaria and I focused on post-conflict resolution and international humanitarian law. And I have never lived through times as turbulent and as unpredictable as today. I think the world is in a very volatile state. We are observing several wars at once with major players that have the risk of escalating. I think NATO is seriously preparing for war in Eastern Europe, and that's well known. I think there is a possibility for a conflict between Taiwan and China, even if it doesn't escalate to a full-blown war. This could cause a disruption for businesses, for supply chains that impact governments as well. So I think we are in quite unprecedented and very difficult and disruptive period at the moment.
Well, look, building on that kind of somber moment for a little bit, let's talk about what you call hacking for a purpose. That's the title of a SANS keynote of yours. By the way, thank you very much for doing that. I appreciate it. I know the delegates will enjoy it. But that title does rather speak to the myriad of nation-state actors who threaten our public authorities, our critical infrastructure, our businesses, as you were just touching on, with all sorts of disruptive attacks and data theft. So could you speak a little bit more to the major state threats?
And to best practice in combating it.
Basically, solve all of cybersecurity, including nation states, in less than 30 seconds, if you can.
Thank you. I think we have very robust playbooks. We have NIST frameworks, ISO frameworks that companies can use to enhance their cybersecurity posture across the board and improve resilience, cyber resilience, business continuity, disaster recovery, third-party risk management. We have the playbooks and we have the best practices. The issue is priorities for different businesses, awareness, and then implementation. And as a consultant, I have been in this business for about 5 years now. I have seen incredible range of maturity from organizations that are critical infrastructure facilities like water and gas, specifically water organizations that are responsible for water supplies that are at a very low level of maturity when it comes to their cybersecurity posture. In organizations that have implemented almost everything correctly, there's always room for improvement, but there are organizations that are high on the maturity scale. So I think the issue for us is not so much knowing how to defend ourselves. I think we do. The issue is implementation and prioritizing the need to improve our cybersecurity resilience in light of the existing potential disruptions from nation states.
Really interesting. And just on tech risk going beyond cyber, we've got chip wars and trade wars and restrictions of supplies and worries about hardware and software and cable cutting, and we could go on, but we're still in at least sort of a global economy. So in terms of your new work as an advisor at Accenture, lots of companies will have quite legitimate dealings or even operations in China, other unstable and potentially adversarial parts of the world. How do you help people navigate that wider tech risk?
Ciaran, that's a great question. And I'm really proud to be collaborating with an incredible array of experts at Accenture, and I'm leading the two strategic cyber risk offerings that we are using in order to exactly help our clients navigate for these geopolitical uncertainties. We've identified a broad range of sources of risk to clients. They don't just stem from cyberspace. We do have elevated risk of cyber espionage, disruptive operations such as ransomware attacks, sabotage, and others such as deepfakes and influence campaigns and how that could also impact the business. But we're also looking at government regulations and policies, as well as the ongoing sanctions, trade, and tariff wars between the US and China. And that's a very dynamic and fast-moving space. And we have a lot of clients reaching out to us and asking us to help them with identifying how will particular sanctions or tariffs or trade wars impact their supply chain, their vendors, their clients, their presence. And for each of them, we're looking at bespoke solutions. We identify first their presence in those different regions, and we analyze their geostrategic risk exposure across all of those various metrics. And then we identify the risks that they most likely will encounter or are encountering, and then we propose mitigating policies. And those policies typically focus on cybersecurity solutions, but they're not only cybersecurity solutions. Sometimes, for example, the recommendation may be that our clients should consider alternative sourcing options or alternative locations where they can position part of their supply chain or production.
Well, look, you're talking here about the tech risk side and kind of operations and how companies think about it. But of course, there's much more to this landscape, isn't there? Yes, there's the countries, the Russias and Chinas and so on, North Korea. But there's technologies too, right? There's this kind of fascinating set of new capabilities developing under this banner of AI. And I think in the past, you've referred to AI as a bit of an arms race, particularly between the US and China. I've really seen that playing out. I like how you described that. But to what extent do you think that's really a thing? And do you think there are any implications you can point to that, apply to organizations that perhaps don't feel at the front line of it? They're not themselves in the AI arms race, but are going to feel the effects in some ways that maybe they don't understand. Are we going to get caught up in that?
Yeah, that's a real possibility, James. And at Accenture, we've been exploring various ways in which to use AI to help our clients to optimize processes at the organization level. And we have a variety of breakthroughs and a variety of specific areas which we are suggesting, yes, AI is fantastic. It will augment your processes. It will optimize them. It will help you to save revenue, to be faster, to produce faster. And it also enhances, in a lot of cases, cybersecurity defense for our clients. We use it to support real-time monitoring of critical networks and systems. We've also used it to provide tools to support predictive maintenance of failing systems. But we also advise them to think about how AI could be leveraged against their companies. And we have seen already some examples where AI is being used for social engineering, and it's enhancing cyber attacks, and it's helping attackers breach the defenses of a company by creating a fake persona. For example, there was this case of an employee who basically was duped by an AI to think that he was speaking to his chief financial officer. And basically the company lost $25 million because he believed that he was talking to his CFO and then wired $25 million to that person. So that's a significant cost for a company because of the use of AI and deepfake. And we have other similar examples. So we try to explain to our clients, governments, and businesses how AI is directly applicable to them. And it could be both a blessing and a curse. And we try to show both sides.
That makes a lot of sense. And I think it's a really wild problem space for us to all try to track through. I love your kind of risk-based and mature approach to it you're describing there and working with companies. But, I feel the need to be salacious near the end here. I mean, is AI going to kill us all? Okay, maybe that's a bit too salacious. Maybe we won't go full Terminators.
And if so, when?
Exactly. We want a precise date.
Let me
need
give you
that
the exact date. I
forecasted.
have it right here. Let me find the exact date.
And the means as well. Look, more seriously, what do you think are some of the broad implications for cybersecurity? You talked about how companies prep for it and think about policy and risk, but what do you think it's going to do to the profession and to cybersecurity more broadly?
I think, and this is my educated guess, I think it's going to augment a lot of our cyber functions. I think AI augmented SOCs are starting to develop. There are quite a few promising startups that are building them. I'm seeing AI being used in pen testing and a lot of other functions. So I think it will help us significantly to improve and standardize the way we do cybersecurity. I am, however, very concerned about how adversaries are going to use it to enhance cyber attacks as well. So far, I think the balance is tipped in favor of defense. I don't see that many usages of AI for cyber operations, apart from influence operations. We've seen a few examples of AI being used for malware generation and so on, but not as much as I think we would have expected by now. So I think the benefit so far is for defense, but I am worried that adversaries are creative and we may not be thinking of all the options in which they will use AI against us.
Well, hang on to the optimistic part of that answer, because we've had very sobering conversations about the state of the world. And also, I think I do need to say this because I've come across the odd listener to this podcast who is very much a generalist and doesn't live in the cybersecurity world. So for the handful of people like that, I need to clarify that AI-powered SOCs are security operations centers rather than things that you might wear on your feet driven by computers. So there you go. Crucial clarification there. Thank you.
Although that sounds awesome. Can we get some of those? We could put them into a pen test. I mean, imagine a sock hijack. Sorry, go on.
That does sound good. I'm available for children's parties, etc. Now, look, we've covered so much, Bilyana, but we have to, I'm afraid, bring things to a close. Thank you so much for all your time.
But don't forget, Ciaran, there's a little bit more we've got to do.
Oh, here we go. Yeah, go on.
Yeah, it's my thing now. I've taken it over.
You have.
As you know, it's only fair if we ask people to listen to us that we give them something really useful at the end.
So, as ever, James, I concede. So, Bilyana, I think we are asking you for
your 30-second takeaway. Look, Bilyana, ultimately, this podcast is about lessons for cybersecurity leaders. So if you had just 30 seconds with a security leader, what would you advise them about the best things they can do to protect themselves against these strong geopolitical headwinds? Something to pay attention to, something to ignore, whatever you like. 30 seconds, please solve all of the geopolitical issues in cybersecurity. Let's go.
Another wonderful question, James. Thank you. I would say that businesses can no longer afford to ignore geopolitics and geopolitical disruptions because they can have material impact on the business. And it is very important to consider their geostrategic risk exposure, their presence in high-risk geographies, and already think about mitigating policies before conflicts occur, not during conflicts.
one of the clearest and I think closest to the 30-second takeaways we've ever had. Well done. Thank you, Bilyana.
It was my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
That is a record. Absolutely. Well, look, Ciaran, I think that's it.
Apart from feedback?
Yes, feedback is always critical, please. We do really read it. We pay attention to it.
We do. And you can leave us feedback at the podcast site, or you can email us at cyberleaderspodcast@sans.org. Tell us what you'd like to hear more of, less of, anything you like.
And with that, thank you very much for listening.
Yes, thank you for listening and keep cybering. So from me, Ciaran Martin.
And me, James Lyne.
It's goodbye.